Ya, lantas seperti apa pandangan Asian Development Bank atau ADB terkait cita-cita pertumbuhan ekonomi Indonesia di tahun ini dan di tahun depan? Langsung saja kami akan membahasnya bersama dengan Direktur ADB Indonesia, Jiro Tominaga. How are you, Jiro?
Thank you very much. I'm very fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out here in CNBC Indonesia.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, according to the latest Asian Development Bank assessment, the ADB assessment, just very recent, Indonesia's economic growth is expected to grow in 4.8% this year in 2023 and 5% in 2024, which these two numbers is a significant slowdown compared to what we have in 2022, which is around 5.3%. So in your perspective, what are actually the key factors, the opportunities and the challenge for Indonesia's economic growth this year and next year?
Thank you. I think maybe probably I should start by saying that Indonesia's economic recovery from the COVID-19 induced recession has been exemplary. The economy has experienced 2.1% negative growth in 2020, but it quickly came up to the positive range, 3.7% in 2021, and then last year, as you mentioned, it is 5.3%. But in 2023, the economy and the global economy as a whole is facing some headwinds. The global economy is slowing down. The monetary policies has been significantly tightened in advanced economies. And then also there have been some disruptions and then volatility in the financial market. We have seen that, right? So in that sense, but even though these adversities, we do project 4.8% economic growth for 2023, which I think is a pretty resilient sort of economic growth in the face of adversity right now. I think there are several reasons for that. One is that Indonesia has quite a large domestic market, which kind of provides a floor for the Indonesian economic growth. And then secondly, the private consumption being about 54% of GDP, and then this year we are expecting some healthy growth in the consumption side. This is because compared to last year, when we still had the COVID-related mobility restriction, that is no longer there. And then also the inflation rate is also moderating right now.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, also we see that the policy environment on the fiscal side and also the monetary side is going to be a slightly supportive of the economic growth. The monetary authority has indicated that the policy reference rate hike that took place in the latter part of 2022 to fight the inflation is now done. And then also the fiscal side, the fiscal deficit of share of GDP was about 2.37% last year. And this year, I'm expecting to have 2.85%, so which is it's a slight, but the positive fiscal impulse. So in this, based on these factors, we do think 4.8% growth, which again is, I think it shows of the resilience rather than a significant downturn from the 5.3% that we had last year.
All right, and how about the 5% target and the assessment you had in ADB for the 2024? It is still a good number.
Yeah, I think it is still a good number. And then also the inflation rate, we expect the inflation rate to come down to about 3.5% by December, and then also go into about 3.0% in the medium term. So I think it would have a good trajectory for economy to grow, and then 5.0%, I think it is a respectable, decent growth.
Respectable, decent growth.
Yes.
Both this year and next year.
And next year.
And how do you actually evaluate the Indonesia's economic fundamentals compared to the Asian Pacific countries' peers for Indonesia?
First of all, I think Indonesian economy has enjoys a strong economic fundamentals. Since pre-COVID situation, since 2003 to 2019, Indonesia enjoyed about the average growth rate of about 5.3% per year. And then also the very important factor for us is the poverty has been steadily falling since then, over the time. So I think there are these sort of good performance anchored on the two fundamentals. First is about the prudent macroeconomic policy side. As you know, from the fiscal policy side, there's a fiscal discipline imposed by adhering to the 3.0% GDP ceiling for the fiscal deficit, and then also 60% of the public debt. And then also from the monetary policy side, it is being managed by independent and capable central bank, managing to target the inflation at low and stable level, about between 2% and 4%.
Yes, 3 plus minus 1%.
Yes, yeah. And then it's also, what is also important to note is the depth with which the policy makers are applying these policy principles, depending on the situation in the economy. For example, in the past COVID crisis situation, the 3% deficit ceiling had been lifted temporarily. So there was a sort of flexible and timely policy actions to deal with the situation. On the, there's also a resource endowment that Indonesia enjoys. One is about the population and demographic resource. It has a large population, youthful population, which provides the basis for the consumption growth, and then also for the prime working age. And also, of course, the natural resources is there.
Yes.
And then particularly
abundant
in the case
of
abundant,
population.
particularly in the sense of shift towards net zero.
Yeah.
There are certain materials that Indonesia has, which is going to be very, very important.
Now that you already mentioned about the sound monetary policy, the implementation by an independent central bank.
Right.
If we talk about a central bank, just very, very recent, this year or just last year, central banks around the world are raising their high interest rates because the high inflation rates everywhere in this world. How do you think the Indonesia's policy, both monetary and fiscal ability to tackle the inflation rate and to maintain its inflation rate in a sound 2 until 4% target, and we reach that target?
Well, I think the short answer to the question is that we have quite a high confidence that the Indonesian authority will be able to manage the inflation rate under the current global economic situation. Indonesia has experienced the surge in inflation like any other countries in the world. Last year in September, the headline inflation rate rise to 6%, but it steadily came down since then. In April, it was 4.4%, and as I mentioned, we consider that is going to be on the medium term to the 3% level. So I think there are reasons for that. Of course, the global market and the commodity prices has softened. The number one sort of the driver for the global inflation. And then also in the sense that Indonesian economy has probably become more competitive compared to the last episode of a global commodity-driven inflation like in 2013. So that pass-through to the consumption prices has been less than previous time. But also, again, depth with which the monetary authority is applying the policies, and then also the track record and credibility that the Bank Indonesia has already established as a manager of stable inflation rate between the 2 and 4%, and largely intact over time. So I think with that, all these elements, I think we have a very good high confidence on the Indonesian authority will be able to manage the inflation rate.
It's really nice to hear the ADB's perspective on this. And moving on to Indonesia's goal of cleaner energy, last November in the G20, Indonesia has secured commitment of the GETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership. And it is also supported by the Asian Development Bank. So as we know, the GETP aims to facilitate a smooth transition for the early coal retirement project, which President Jokowi already planned it would be around 2050. So could you provide an update so far for the GETP itself?
Well, I think probably let me start by saying that really the climate change issue is the defining issue for our generation this year, this time. And then also in terms of the global fight against climate change is either be won or lost in how we do in Asia. Just because Asia's population share and then also the economic share, and also in terms of contribution to the global economic growth. So this is going to be important. And in Indonesia, we have been very fortunate enough to be able to form a good partnership with the Indonesian government in supporting their effort towards energy transition. 2 years ago, together with the Indonesian government and also the Philippines, that we launched a program called Energy Transition Mechanism in Glasgow in COP26. So this is basically a scheme to mobilize public sector, private sector, and then philanthropic and then other resources to finance the early coal retirement and repurposing of coal retirement, and then also the development of the renewable energy capacity, and then also the storage capacity, maybe batteries, for example, to replace this coal retirement. I think your question about the progress, I would say that the progress is quite well. It's been evidenced by the number of actions that have been taking place
since November
within the short period of time. And then I think the November one, there are the highlights in the November in the sideline of Bali summit, G20 summit, that Indonesian government has launched what we call the Energy Transition Mechanism Country Platform. And also there was an MOU signed among the stakeholders to pursue a specific transaction of early coal retirement that has been agreed on.
Right.
And then thirdly, you mentioned about the JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, the announced at the sideline, which has the very ambitious target of greenhouse gas emission, as well as aiming to mobilize $20 billion from public and private sector financing. I think it is very important on discussing about Indonesia's activities in energy transition. One is that several things that I think we should highlight. One is that it is going to be a long journey. It is about Indonesia's plan says by 2060 it will be the net zero. So it is a long time horizon we are looking at. And secondly is that all these initiatives that has been taking place so far, we see the great commitment and then also the activity by the Indonesian government, and we're trying to help in order for them to achieve their vision. And thirdly is about the role that Indonesia is playing right now in the overall global support for energy transition, that Indonesia is really leading the way to showing the blueprint.
Leading the way,
I think showing the blueprint for other countries to follow.
And how does it leading the way compared to other peer countries, let's say the Asian Pacific countries?
I think it's specific activities are taking place, and then as I mentioned about working on the specific transaction as a pilot and proof of concept transaction for the early retirement of coal-fired power plant, for example. There is a very important specific step that's taken also in the Indonesia country platform launch, which provides the sort of the financing vehicles and mechanism for government to support the transaction of early retirement as well as renewable energy development.
In terms of this clean, greener energy transition for all the nations are trying to ultimately achieve, in 2060, the net zero emission, how big actually the financing need, how big is actually the cost needed in order to all the countries ultimately supporting each other to finally reach the net zero emission target? As you said before, it's a long journey, but then again, we know on the financing side, it has a lot of things to do, the cooperation and so on. Your opinion on this?
Well, of course, the financing is needed. And then what is quite evident is that public financing from the government or institution like us will probably not be enough to finance. So what is very important is the targeted action towards mobilizing the private sector financing to come into this effort on the energy transition nationwide.
And how do you think you can provide us an outline of suggestion offered by the Asian Development Bank as well to support the formulation of post-coal sustainable policy, and in the other hand, to achieve a sustainable development with the objective of reaching the net zero emission ultimately in 2060?
Yes,
Jiro?
it is a very long journey. So it is very hard to specifically say this is the one that we need to do, but I think probably 3 areas. One is that, of course, we need to develop the renewable energy capacity. And then that is not only about the generation capacity, but it is also about the investment around the auxiliary associated activities. For example, it is about energy efficiency, or if it is about the transmission lines, or it is about the battery storage, for example, right? So that is going to take place. And as I mentioned, the financing is needed, and then private sector financing will be sorely needed. A second is the just and an affordable transition. There will be a segment of the population who will be affected negatively by the transition, particularly those people who are working in the value chain of those fossil fuel industry. So there needs to be a thorough assessment of how this impact is going to be there, to emerge for different segments of the population, and then design a targeted sort of intervention in order for us to mitigate their impact or protect their livelihoods. And then in those two areas, ADB has been working very closely with the government in terms of providing the support in forms of loans or technical assistance, so that we can be a good partner to take this long journey together with Indonesia.
And lastly, a short remarks that you will give as from the ADB perspective towards Indonesia's economy and also its goal on achieving the greener economy transition.
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think Indonesia has a very strong fundamentals in macroeconomic, and these factors that I mentioned will continue. And the one factor, again, also is additional one, is that the momentum towards reform, so that Indonesia keeps changing to become, maintain its competitiveness, and then also dynamic economic activities in the very uncertain and competitive global economy. On the vision towards net zero, I think it's going to be a long trip, and then also Indonesia will probably need a lot of partners, and then we want to be very happy to be part of that important part of that journey.
And thank you so much for supporting Indonesia on achieving that target. Thank you so much, Jiro, for coming out here in CNBC Indonesia. A pleasure to have you. Thank you.